Hello and welcome. My name is Barry Ritz. I'm the Vice President and Head of Regulatory, Scientific, and Medical Affairs at Nestle Health Science US, and the current Chair of the Board of Directors of the Council for Responsible Nutrition. I'm also a founder of and active in CRN's Nutrition Access Task Force, which is the driver behind today's webinar topic. Some housekeeping. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand. Please feel free to submit questions to the Q&A pod. If we run out of time and don't get to the questions at the end of the webinar, which is likely, we'll send them to the speakers who will reach out with their responses. With that, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Keith Miller. Dr. Miller is a native of Greencastle, Indiana. Following his undergraduate degree at DePaul University, received his MD from Indiana School of Medicine. He has spent the last 15 years at the University of Louisville, where he completed his general surgery, residency, and trauma surgical critical care fellowship. He joined the faculty of the University of Louisville Department of Surgery in 2012. Currently, Dr. Miller is a fellow of the American College of Surgeons and associate professor of surgery in trauma and critical care at the University of Louisville. He serves as the associate trauma medical director and associate program director for general surgery and is vice chair for the Kentucky Committee on Trauma. He's authored numerous scientific articles and book chapters and has been the recipient of multiple teaching, community, mentorship, and service awards. His research interests include violent injury prevention, firearm injury, shock resuscitation, critical care nutrition, and care of the critically injured trauma patient. I've had the opportunity to get to know Dr. Miller over the past 2 years, and I've really appreciated his passion for the topic of nutrition access, as well as the unique perspective he brings as a trauma surgeon. I personally reached out to Dr. Miller to invite him to be part of this webinar, and I'm so happy that you can be with us. Thank you, Keith.
No problem. No, thank you for the invitation, Barry. I think a lot of you are probably wondering why you're sitting here listening to a trauma surgeon. I think it's a combination of both bad luck and Barry. But I'll see if I can share my screen here, and we've got a lot to go through pretty quickly. So I'll try to move through it at a breakneck pace where you can still get something out of it at the end of the day. So what we're going to be talking about is the link between food insecurity, access, and gun violence. And hopefully there's something thematically that you can take from this and apply to your everyday world, although hopefully some of these issues don't bump up to next to you on a regular basis. As far as disclosures go, I do want to point out, I do know Barry. I'm a faculty on the Nestle Nutrition Fellowship. I don't think it's relevant to this particular topic because we're not talking about specific products or anything like that. What is relevant is that I'm a surgeon, so I have all the inherent limitations that most surgeons do. My primary job is to stop bleeding and fix holes and do those sorts of things, and that's not really what I'm talking about today. I'm talking about a lot of public health issues, and so it's also relevant that I'm not a public health expert. But as you'll see as we move through this talk, this is something that I'm very passionate about, that does mean a lot to me, and something that I can't ignore in my world, nor any of you in your worlds. So as far as what we're going to be talking about today, first and most important, food access, not production, is the central issue in the United States, and I can't emphasize that enough. We're going to take a look at the relationship between food security and violence at both geopolitical and neighborhood levels. We're going to discuss how a history of targeted disinvestment in the United States has led to the concentrated emergence of multiple public health issues in a subset of the American population and hasn't been distributed across the population as a whole. I think you're probably getting why a trauma surgeon may have anything to say about this issue. Finally, we're going to appreciate that if we invest in these areas that have been disinvested in for a very long period of time, we can address multiple public health issues like gun violence and food insecurity, maybe at the same time. So this background's all very familiar with you, so I tried to keep this part short, but for purposes of review, food security means that you have the physical and economic access to food to meet your dietary needs as well as food preferences. Insecurity implies that there's a disruption somewhere along that continuum. And then access is a little more complex. It's a function of having the money to acquire the food, transportation to get to the distribution centers of the food, and spatial availability of distribution centers in order to acquire that food, feed you and your family. Food insecurity, the prevalence in the United States specifically, is you can find numbers all over the map, 11 to 12%, 15%. Here you can see the prevalence across multiple countries that from a Human Development Index perspective, based on the United Nations assignment, are similar to the United States. You can see those across the board. We all do know that during the COVID pandemic, there's been a substantial increase in food insecurity throughout the country. In my home state of Kentucky, you're talking about 120% increase. So it has been substantial. Again, we all know that food insecurity is associated with general health. It's linked to nearly every outcome, whether you're talking about chronic illness, acute illness, mental health. This study from the Canadian Community Health Survey showed that individuals in food insecure households die 9 years earlier, with an increased mortality across all causes of death except cancer. The strongest association was with things that I may take care of on a daily basis: traumatic accidents and infections. Causality, anytime you're looking to try to say, well, this causes this, it becomes super difficult. And that's because of the many overlapping confounders that are present here. Poverty, unemployment, multiple socioeconomic determinants of health seem to impact the same populations over and over again. And again, that is probably the most important point that we're going to take from this presentation. Something a little closer that I deal with every day, I put gun violence in quotations. It's a bit of a colloquial term that means different things to different people. So we are pushing the narrative that if you are going to address it as a public health issue, you need to appreciate the fact that this is an umbrella term that includes intentional self-inflicted injuries, accidental injuries, mass shootings, interpersonal assault, and shootings involving law enforcement. There's significant overlap in the root cause contributors to each of these problems, but there's also very important distinctions when it comes to root cause contributors. And so they can be thought of as different entities, with the commonality being that they represent a complex relationship between humans and firearms and how those things are dealt with. It is a disease of the young. There's no doubt about it. And if you look at it, it's a leading cause of death in the 1st through 5th decades of life. You can see accidental injury, suicide, homicide, which all include an element of firearm injury. In Louisville, our average age of injury is 29 years old. That number's driven up by a lot of your intentional self-inflicted injuries or suicides. And that's important. Suicides historically comprise 2/3 of all gun deaths in the United States, which is an important point to remember. The financial cost is substantial. Not only does this cost our communities from a pain, suffering, grief standpoint, it's also extremely expensive, costing $900,000 to $1 million per homicide, and about half that for non-fatal injuries. So this impacts our young people. And so if you look at this from a traumatic injury and death, if you're trying to put this into context as to how burdensome this issue is in the United States, in many of our cities and across the country, this graph helps demonstrate that for someone like me. If you look at motor vehicle accident deaths, you can see over the last 20 years have decreased in incidence, whereas firearm injury and mortality has increased. Interestingly, one of these we have applied a public health approach to, and the other we have not. And then in the last 5 years, these lines have in fact crossed when you look at years of potential life lost. And we now lose more years of potential life to firearms than we do motor vehicles in the United States. A year of potential life lost being a number 70, which is the average number of years in America that we live, minus the age at the time of death. Again, that number could be higher or lower, but the age at the time of death, if you're shot and killed at age 20, you've lost 50 years of potential life. And you've seen that these numbers have crossed in the last 5 years. So if you're not, motor vehicle accidents, let's look at some non-traumatic public health issue that maybe we feel like happened to multiple people that we know, and that would be COVID-19. And during the pandemic years, we looked at this very closely. You can see in Louisville, Kentucky, Jefferson County, in the last 3 years coinciding with the pandemic, we've had a tremendous uptick in firearm injury, where we've now moved over the 1 per 1,000 incidents of firearm injury. And if you look at this graph, just very briefly, what it shows is that young people were losing a tremendous number of years of life to firearms here. And this is the COVID pandemic primarily affecting our older population, so much so that gun violence costs twice as many years of potential life 10,000 to 5,000 of COVID-19. That's not to de-emphasize the importance of COVID-19. I know we've all lost people to it, but it's to try to put this into context and perspective as to what the cost of this issue has been in my city, in Louisville, Kentucky, and many cities across the country. Now we get to causes. And so I think this is a complex discussion. I'm going to try to boil it down to five or six slides. Here we're going to look at food insecurity and gun violence. So it's a little bit of an oversimplification, but I think the point will be obvious. So let's start with an easy one, food insecurity. Now there's an obvious explanation for this, right? There's too many people and not enough food in the world and in our country. Going back to objective one, we'll see if this plays out as true. I don't know if many of you saw in the media this week, we just surpassed the 8 billion mark in the world as far as our global population. If you look up until the 1700s, we're talking about 600 million people and then explosive population growth to now 8 billion. Interestingly, there is a carrying capacity for the world based on our per capita food production. No one really knows what that number is. Hundreds of years ago, Antoine von Leeuwenhoek, who's this individual up here, calculated it in an interesting way. The population of Holland at the time was 1 million, and the total landmass of Holland comprised 113,400th of the entire globe. So he sort of threw out the number that he thought that was pretty comfortable. So he said about 13.4 billion people would be the carrying capacity of the earth. Well, whether that's true or not, all of that's dependent on what our production capabilities are. There's no doubt that the rate of population growth has decreased, but we're still looking at 11 billion people in 2100. So that's a tremendous number of mouths to feed. And so maybe the explanation is that the demand exceeds supply. So if you look at supply, this is a map that I think puts it again in a perspective that I can understand. This is a average per capita caloric production across the world. And you can see that if we're going to say that 2,000 to 2,500 kilocalories per day is sort of the average caloric requirement for an individual, every country that's in this shade of green or however darker appears to have adequate per capita caloric production to feed everyone in their country. This map was a little bit surprising to me. So then the issue becomes, well, okay, so if we look at this cutoff point right here, this dotted red line, and we see that the majority, or the entire world is above that break point, the United States produces nearly 4,000 calories per person per day. We export 20%, a third of it goes in a landfill, and yet despite all that, we've got an 11 to 12% incidence of food insecurity, which is disturbing. So it's more complex than just production. You all know this, again, the 4 dimensions of food security, whether you're talking about availability, which means you have sufficient quantities available, access, we talked about that a little bit, stability, meaning it's available not only today, but tomorrow and in the foreseeable future, and then utilization. How do we store it? How do we process it? And if you look at from a United States perspective over the last several years, I think one of those areas sticks out more than the others as a place where we've been deficient, and it certainly isn't production, it's an access issue. Just to shed a little more light on this, again, we've already talked about availability and production. We've talked about access. An example of stability would be, the invasion of Ukraine, which disrupted the stability of the food supply, crop damage, chain disruption, natural disasters can certainly do this too. As far as utilization goes, I think you're talking about something that we take for granted oftentimes in the United States, which, we have a refrigerator, we can store food, we can prepare. We're planning meals for next week, and we can do that because our ability to utilize the food and store the food in that meaningful way. If you're displaced from your home during a period of geopolitical conflict or natural disaster, you may lose the means whereby you can do that. So these are the 4 dimensions of food security. We certainly have variations on themes here in the United States, whether you're talking about food deserts, which are low-income communities lacking stores that sell healthy and affordable food. Obviously, that's dependent on if you're in an urban or a rural area. Food swamps, which have high concentrations of unhealthy food options like convenience stores, liquor stores, fast food restaurants is where the majority of caloric intake comes from in certain areas. It should be known that those two terms are frowned upon. They do tend to stigmatize regions and should be used very carefully. The food mirage is a newer one that has come up in the last few years, which means that grocery stores are everywhere. You're a foodie town, but these foods are economically inaccessible for a certain percentage of the population. So these are variations on a theme when it comes to access. And they also demonstrate the complexity of this issue. So how do we go from a society that produces 4,000 kilocalories, which is more than sufficient, to seeing food insecurity at the individual and interpersonal level or the household level? And this socioecologic model, which you're going to see a couple times, demonstrates that very well. And I think what you're seeing here is multiple root cause contributors across the individual level and the societal level. And we're going to parse that out a little bit more as we go on. Gun violence. Now we're switching gears again, so stick with me. I know it's a back and forth sort of discussion. What are the causes of gun violence? Is it bad luck, bad people? These are the things that when you're sitting around the house, you talk about, bad families, choices, drugs, groups, gangs, too many guns, violent culture. All of these things are sort of the things that come up in conversation. I think obviously there's a tremendous number of firearms in the United States. I think this map demonstrates it very well. You can see this is civilian gun ownership. There's the same number of civilian firearms in Germany as there is in Texas, and China as in California. There's a tremendous number of guns, but you can't end there. Again, this is an interaction, a complex interaction between firearms and humans. So you have to pull the socioecologic model into this discussion. And here you're seeing individual, interpersonal, community, and societal level issues that are contributing to what we see on a daily basis. So that looks very much like that. And as you start to pull these pieces together, what becomes glaringly obvious, even to a dumb surgeon, is that there's significant overlap in several of these issues. And so now we're sort of laying the foundation for where we're going from here, but there's significant, and it's not just in one level, it's across the levels. You're seeing multiple things here. What about disparities? Are there disparities evident in food insecurity and gun violence? Certainly, if you look at geographic disparity, you can see that the Southeast has higher incidence of food insecurity. Kind of the red areas demonstrate that. Interestingly, again, illustrating the point that food production is probably not the central area, is not the central issue. This is where production, crop production happens, and you can see many of those along the Mississippi Delta and such are areas where food insecurity is higher than the national average. So that just tells us that this is more complex than just a production issue at this point. Obviously, as climates change, as our world changes, maybe production does become an issue as you're looking at significant agricultural yield reductions in areas that produce a lot of what we eat on a daily basis. How about gun violence? Again, flipping, here we go. So what about gun violence? Are there geographic disparities here? Certainly, this is the CDC graph in firearm mortality by state in 19 and 2020. You can see unfortunately, they had to move the scale up, which we've seen in multiple maps when it comes to public health issues across the United States. But it, again, does impact areas geographically very similar to what we see with a food insecurity perspective. So there does seem to be something going on here. Or what about racial disparities, ethnic disparities? Again, if we use the 11% national average, the Caucasian white population is a 7% incidence of food insecurity based on this study, Hispanic and Black 16 and 21%. And interestingly, if you look over the last 20 years, regardless of whether it deflects up or down, when you're talking about the nationwide average incidence, they move up and down together, which is also interesting and disheartening. So there are racial and ethnic disparities in food insecurity. So it's not uniformly, the burden is not uniformly distributed across our populations. What about gun violence? Here you're going to see this graph or these pie charts. Stick with me here. So the 80% of white individuals killed by firearm are killed by suicide or intentional self-inflicted injury. 80% of our Black population that dies by firearm are killed by homicide. And looking at it another way, 20 times more likely to be shot and killed under the age of 29 if you're a Black individual than a white individual. Here's a study that we did a few years ago where we looked at recidivism, a fancy word for if you're shot once, what are the chances you're going to be shot again? And the Black population follows this curve over a 10-year time frame, and the white population follows this curve. So there's obviously differences here. You can't leave it there. You have to start to explain why you're seeing these things. So this may be a conversation you have. Is there a relationship between violence and hunger? Let's try to pull these two things together. And I would say, yeah, absolutely. Are they related? How are they related? Well, I think there is a causative relationship. What I've shown you are several associations, but let's try to dive into the causative component. Which one causes which? Is it food insecurity that causes gun violence, or gun violence causes food insecurity? Well, I think it's a bidirectional causative relationship, which means they both contribute to one another. Anything else here? Well, I think there's some external contributors that both share. that impact those things too. But then if you ask me how many of my patients have been injured by firearms, say, I'm hungry and I was shot and injured. And I would answer that very few. So please explain. And then this will get to the layers of complexity from one to another. So objective 2, that took a long time to get through 1, but examine the relationship between food security and violence at the geopolitical and neighborhood level. So association, causation, certainly war equals hunger, hunger equals war. Hunger certainly has precipitated conflict in the past. This is a well-established connection in human history. War impedes food imports, raises food prices, interrupts food supply, and reduces disposable income. Certainly, starvation has been weaponized in human history. Multiple examples of that, so many that prompted the United Nations adopting Resolution 2417, which strongly condemned weaponizing starvation. So a common enough practice that the UN felt like they had to adopt a resolution to condemn that notion. So what can you say about a geopolitical? We're talking about countries, nations, and conflict impacting food security. Can you extrapolate that over to neighborhoods and households in the United States? It is difficult, but I think, is there any literature to support a causative relationship between these two things? There's multiple studies here I point out. If you want to go to the literature, very low food security, mothers and children, 60% of them described a life-changing violent event. In food insecure households, parent to child psychological, physical aggression. Food insecurity strongly correlated with sexual, physical, psychological violence. Children living in food insecure regions were 6 times more likely to be exposed by violence. That means by age 4. Some modeling studies out there show for every 1% increase in food insecurity, there was an associated 12% increase in violent crime. And the last study looked at Atlanta specifically and showed the relationship between low food access regions and a high prevalence of gun violence. So as we look at this, how do you start to parse this out? How do you start to explain these things? Certainly 4 of these, this is the prior slide sticking out down here, and 4 of these involve children being exposed to violent events and that association with food insecurity. And we're all familiar with adverse childhood experiences. Firearm injury or witnessing or having a loved one injured by firearm is certainly an adverse childhood experience that has long-term morbidity and mortality across the spectrum of illness, as you can see here. It impacts neurocognitive development at a key period of time and alters that in ways that we don't understand. So in some ways, you can believe that food insecurity may be an environment conducive for potential for adverse childhood events, which can subsequently lead to violence. Gun violence in and of itself is an adverse childhood event. And so you start to develop causative relationships here, and it becomes a cyclical relationship between food insecurity and gun violence precipitated by multiple root cause contributors. What about this something else? I was talking about this up here that may cause both things. What about this common external contributor and significant disparities? Here we're going to kind of reach in and look at this targeted disinvestment that has led to the emergence of multiple public health issues in a subset of the American population. And I'm going to do that through a series of maps. And I know I'm running out of time. So map 1, this is Louisville, Kentucky. I'm assuming you don't have a context or any background on what the demographics of Louisville, Kentucky look like. But this is a map that came out from the BBC by the U.S. Housing and Urban Development and after Muhammad Ali passed. And it looked at Muhammad Ali's hometown and the legacy of segregation. And so you can see that the green dots are Black residents and the orange dots are white residents. And so this is the context I want you to interpret many of the following maps that you're going to look at. Here's a food access map. We created this based on proximity to grocery store, median household income, transportation, and you can see again. Okay, so highest access areas are green, lowest access in red, and you're starting to see that leans to the left over here too. Here's firearm injuries from 16 to 20. Again, you're looking, these red dots are where they're happening. If you want to look at fatalities, you can see. And so why does a trauma surgeon have anything to say about this or find this to be appalling? And it's because of these maps. As I look at these, again, firearm injury leans left, food access leans left. And you have to begin to explain why you're seeing this pattern over and over and over again. If you put them together, there's almost a linear association between the incidence of firearm injury in Louisville and food insecurity. This has been demonstrated not only in Louisville, but Atlanta and other cities across the country. And as you come back to this socioecologic model, you can begin to dissect maybe some reasons. What are some commonalities? What are some things that mutually contribute to both of these public health issues? And I want to focus on one, structural violence and structural racism, because I think it's a hard one to understand. Certainly, if you're a 43-year-old white guy, it's hard to understand. But I want to give you a tangible example of how that could translate into what we're seeing today. What is the something else? Can structural violence be an example of the something else that contributes to both of these entities happening in the same geographic regions? Structural violence, for those of you all know this, but they're structures or institutions that harm people, prevent them from meeting their basic needs. It's closely related, or the type of structural racism. Systematic, it's systemic, creates unfair disadvantages for populations. It's hard to see, it's normalization of the abnormal. Here, this picture kind of demonstrates that you take a whole population and you take a bunch of risk factors, you put it through the structural violence filter, and all of a sudden a small percentage of the population, excuse me, bears the brunt of the majority of the risk factors and root cause contributors. And so how do we make this how do I represent this tangibly? Well, this is the fourth map that I want you to look at, which is the redlining map in Louisville, Kentucky. If you're not familiar with redlining, which I bet you are, it's the practice of denying services to residents of certain areas based on racial or ethnic composition of those areas. The FHA did this in the post-Great Depression era. They tried to reinfuse capital back into the United States. They mapped 200 American cities, 200 of the largest American cities at that time, and said, where do we want to invest money? And they may, in these maps, assign grades A through D to neighborhoods within these 200 plus cities. And it looked like this. So an A grade was a homogeneous population, meaning predominantly white. D grade was an undesirable population, or at least quote unquote, an infiltration of it. It was a high percentage of Black Americans or immigrant populations. Most A areas had specific deed restrictions. I included one from Louisville. This is a Green Line neighborhood that said no person other than one of the white or Caucasian race shall be permitted to occupy any property in this blah, 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 blah. So that's how A areas stayed A areas and stayed green. These policies were explicitly persisted into the 70s. And obviously, I'm going to show you how the impact is extended well beyond that, because every city has its history. And this city may not be applicable to your city, but your city will have its own similar history. This is a flood map. We're right on the Ohio River. So this is from 1937. And you can see that all this blue area was underwater. Here's an outline. That's terrible lines. I drew those. I'm sorry. But this shows you the where the river was. And all of this blue portion was underwater. Here's Churchill Downs, which is going to be down here somewhere. Here's the redlining map. Here's the BBC map that showed you where Black and white residents reside. And here you can see that the redlined areas, red and yellow, the quote unquote undesirable neighborhoods and populations where capital was not reinvested over 100 years or nearly 100 years ago, coincide with those areas where our vulnerable populations were forced to live. So if you look at gun violence in particular, we looked at this a few years ago, and you were 6 times more likely to be shot if you lived in a redlined area than if you lived in a green area based on the HOLC map. I already showed you the linear association between food access and gun violence as well. So you begin to see how maps and policies, more important than maps, over 90 years ago, have impact that lasts today, that we're seeing across multiple public health issues, whether you're talking about food access or whether you're talking about gun violence. Supermarket redlining is a term that's pulled off that. That's a disinclination to put supermarkets in areas populated by minority communities or low-income neighborhoods. And you can see that has played out. Poorest neighborhoods, 44% less supermarket space than the richest neighborhoods. So not only has capital reinvestment been redlined, but so too has our distribution as to where food is available to the population. So the point here, structural racism is a potent contributor to the observed disparities in firearm injury, food insecurity. And then I just wanted to throw this map from a COVID-19 death rate perspective. Again, Jefferson County, Louisville, Kentucky, you can see heavily leans to the left, and the burden of COVID-19, a viral pandemic, has been disproportionately distributed across our populations. So there's the redlining map on top of that. So, but there's good news. Through working towards food justice, we can eliminate some of this, and through developing safer communities, that this work is synergistic in nature, and you start to take these root cause contributors away and you start to address multiple public health issues. So the efforts of this group are not only working to improve food access, but also to reduce firearm violence. And that may not have been readily apparent. And not only food access and firearm violence, but multiple other public health issues. So for the work of this group, I thank you on behalf of all of us that are on the outside looking in. So I tried to keep it to the time frame. I think in conclusion, I've belabored this point. Food access is not the issue. Food insecurity and gun violence share multiple root cause contributors. They shared stark disparities in who is impacted in the United States. But the good news is that presents an opportunity. If you address one of these issues, you may inadvertently positively impact another issue as well. So I'll wrap mine up, and I'm supposed to be the depressing part of the talk, and then I think we're going to move to a more optimistic look at everything. Is that right, Barry? And moving forward. So thank you all for your time, and I'll be happy to take any questions at the end of everything.
Thank you, Dr. Miller. That was fascinating. So I'm Micah Osborne. I'm the head of the Nutrition Access Task Force. I'm actually here just to introduce the next speakers. So the next speakers are Amy Durkowski, Alyssa Killingsworth, and Laurel Harvey. All three of them work with Convoy of Hope. Convoy of Hope is an international humanitarian relief organization with a driving passion to feed the world. With a long history as an early responder in times of natural disasters, Convoy of Hope has been a 4-star charity, as recognized by Charity Navigator since 2002. Convoy of Hope has responded to more than 550 disasters around the world and has served more than 200 million people since its founding in 1994. Convoy of Hope's ongoing work includes rural and urban community engagement, children's feeding, women's empowerment, and agricultural training. Their goal is to bring hope to those who need it most, and they are honored to partner with businesses, government agencies, churches, and other nonprofits in providing help to the impoverished, hungry, and hurting. The CRN has decided to partner with Convoy of Hope and a few other organizations in bringing information to our group, and I hope you enjoy their talk.
Thank you, Micah. It is an honor to share this platform with others who share the same concern that Convoy of Hope has to feed the hungry. Convoy of Hope's motto is that we have a driving passion to feed the world. We do this through several initiatives, including the one I'm going to briefly talk about. I work in our global programming division where I support our children's feeding initiatives around the world. Next slide. Convoy is presently in 29 countries where we are feeding almost 500,000 children a day. We have set our sights on feeding 1 million children per day by the year 2030. We believe in targeting children because we know that providing meals can transform the lives of children, the lives of their families, and ultimately their communities. We first start by identifying countries that have significant need. We consider national level prevalence rates, poverty levels, and we also consider who else might be working there. This process would be similar to how a program center in the US might be identified. From there, we begin to identify communities at the local level that aren't being supported by anyone else. Once we identify those communities, we partner with local schools where we provide daily meals. That's how we choose where we work, but the next step is in deciding who is going to do the work. There are 2 ways that we do this. First, we have brick and mortar offices in some countries. We hire local individuals and they are employed by Convoy of Hope. The other way is by partnering with other like-minded NGOs that are working in country already, and we help by resourcing them. Either way, our staff in country typically works through the local church. This provides a volunteer basis for the enormous amount of work that is done. The church is an entrance point into communities, and ultimately, they become our exit strategy as well, since they will continue to be a presence in communities long after Convoy leaves. So where does this food come from? Well, that depends. Some countries receive containers from us of fortified meal packs. Our local volunteers might take those and put their own twist of flavors or add vegetables to them. In some countries, local food is procured and prepared. But regardless of whether food is shipped or procured, we work with our local staff to make sure meals meet the World Food Program school feeding standards. In addition to feeding, these communities also need WASH training. We do this because if we don't educate on WASH, sanitation, and hygiene, feeding children will not result in its full benefit. Next slide. Finally, I'd like to take you to one of our program countries, Burkina Faso, where our local staff ensures that 13,000 children are fed every school day. While feeding there, our staff noticed high rates of undernourished children. We applied for a USAID IFRP grant, where we were able to provide extra help to children that fell within the 1,000-day window. We educated mothers of these young children on essential nutrition and WASH actions and provided an RUTF, which is a ready-to-use therapeutic food. And within a few short months, we were able to see children who fell once below a -3 Z-score come into normal ranges. Mothers told stories of how their children were growing and developing, but miraculously recovered. Children who wouldn't eat were now eating. Children who weren't crawling were now crawling. Additionally, feeding the school-age children had an impact as well. Teachers and school administrators reported to me that once meals were provided to their children, the attendance improved, as did their test scores. These are examples of how providing children with a meal can transform their lives. Children's feeding initiatives are typically the entrance point into a community, and Alyssa is now going to talk about other initiatives that are next steps for accessing food.
All right, thanks so much, Amy. Great to be on with all of you today, and thanks so much for taking the time to join us. We're excited to be part of this task force and just learn alongside you guys. So my name is Alyssa Killingsworth, and I serve alongside Amy on our global program team here at Convoy of Hope. And Amy serves as the nutritionist for our children's feeding initiative. And something here at Convoy we very much believe in is a holistic approach to community development. So what does that really mean? So alongside the children's feeding, which is focused on nutrition and meeting children in school so that they can get a healthy education, we do agriculture. So earlier we heard about food accessibility, affordability, and availability is kind of what we also attribute to when we talk about agriculture in our programming. So across the world, we're in 29 different countries. When looking at a holistic approach to community development, we have agriculture. And agriculture looks a couple different ways. And Amy alluded to the need for agriculture to be on our programming alongside in the sustainability aspect of our programming. So if food isn't available or accessible or affordable, what do we do? And so Amy alluded to bringing food in to those countries where it's needed most and where they're most vulnerable. We also work alongside farmers, students, and community members to really increase the amount of food supply there locally. So that can look anything like community gardens, school gardens, church gardens, family gardens. So really working at every single level of a community to empower them with the tools they need to grow their own food and increase their food security. So at this time, we're excited that we have engaged over 23,000 individuals last year in agricultural training. And this is a great example, a great photo of one of our school gardens. And as you can see, the students are very excited for the school skills that they're learning to increase food security in their communities. Youth empowerment is also important to us. So anytime that we can get those students involved is a huge win. So also along with our holistic programming, I'll speak to our Women's Empowerment Initiative. So along in Global Program, we see that family unit, and who else is there? Of course, the mothers. And so we've learned that to approach family dynamics, women's empowerment is a huge win for everyone involved. So our women's empowerment initiatives include economic empowerment, family health empowerment, and girls empowerment. When we talk about economic empowerment, that is walking alongside women through financial and business training, job training, and providing them with seed capital or a grant for them to start their own businesses. We've seen huge success of women all across the world really doing well and empowering not only themselves, but also their children and other women in their communities. Alongside economic empowerment, we have our family health empowerment initiatives. This looks like mothers clubs or breastfeeding circles, bringing together communities so that they can learn about healthy nutrition, early childhood stimulation, feminine hygiene, and other aspects in their communities that can serve their families well. We've seen great success with this as well. And our final in women's empowerment, I'll switch the slide here, is our girls empowerment. So we saw the need, we saw an opportunity, I would say, that after schools, we have our clubs, and these are girls empowerment, and we have boys programming as well. But meeting the needs and meeting these girls where they're at to talk about leadership, strong morals and values, continuing education opportunities, along with feminine hygiene, WASH, so water, sanitation, and hygiene practices, and any other ways that we can empowerment for their brighter futures that lay ahead. Also, I show these pictures, these are great. We've had about over 35,000 women and girls engaged in our empowerment programs of last year. But specifically, one of these pictures makes me really excited. And at the top right, you can see that there are some women from Nepal. And Convoy of Hope responded to an earthquake in 2015 in the community of Kittung, and there was high food insecurity. And when you get into a disaster situation, that is just extremely prevalent. What we found through women's empowerment and agricultural training, these women were able to create tea farms, and now their tea leaves are sought after across the world for how well they produce this cash crop. So changing the narrative and empowering women and girls all across the world. And now I'm very excited to pass over the mic to Laurel Harvey, who's going to talk a little bit about what our domestic programming looks like. So Laura, I'll go ahead and invite you onto the screen.
Thanks, Alyssa.
Thank you.
Yes, thanks for taking time today, and we're excited to share with you about, boy, we're moving fast. Alyssa, I can't talk quite that fast. Okay, so I want to tell you about Sophia. I'm okay, and I ain't hungry, and my mom don't need help with money. I just need a job. That was Sophia, an 8-year-old girl who lives in rural Missouri. She showed up at a food packing site a couple of houses down from where she lives. Our partner remembers the moment because she just punched a little boy in the nose. Sophia was a scrapper with a hard shell. She had to be to get food, wandering the streets, unwatched, unsupervised, as she wandered through town. So there stood Sophia. Sorry, we're having a little technical. There we go. So there stood Sophia, asking for a job, but too proud and guarded to admit any need. Our partners explained to Sophia that she was too young for them to hire, but that if her mom gave permission, she was welcome to volunteer packing food for the school feeding program. Sophia was ecstatic. What does addressing children's food insecurity look like stateside? There's so many regulations. We can't monitor children's growth or their performance in school or their behavior, yet kids are still hungry. A few stats we've learned from a study done at the University of Michigan. We know that 1 in 4 children in rural America go to bed hungry. We know that rural communities make up 63% of all U.S. counties, and of all counties in the United States, these rural counties show the highest food insecurity rates. Persistent child poverty in many rural communities constitutes a crisis across America. Conditions in some rural communities rival conditions in developing nations. In much of Appalachia, for example, life expectancy is lower than in Bangladesh or in Vietnam. The lack of appropriate infrastructure, including transportation, access to healthcare, and fresh fruits and vegetables, along with geographic isolation and non-existent broadband capacity, create obstacles to making effective change in rural communities across America. The needs in urban America are the same, but the difference in rural America is access to help. I want to share some initiatives we are doing here at Convoy of Hope to help address these needs. We work with faith-based charitable nonprofits. We offer training, coaching, resourcing to rural community influencers. We have 5 areas that we're working in. The first one is daily feeding. One of our partners we work with is feeding 1 meal daily, 5 days a week to 30,000 children in 104 rural schools in southern Missouri and Arkansas. We send a minimum of 2 tractor trailer loads of product a month. We provide different components of their meals. That might be a plum organic product or fruit cups or peanut butter and jelly minis or even the paper products that they serve on. At one point, we delivered so many loads from Hormel of Skippy peanut butter and jelly minis that they named their forklift Skippy. The second thing we're working on is snacks for teachers. We recognize that kids come to school hungry, so that affects everything, their performance, their behavior. So we provide snacks to teachers to have available during the school day and specifically during testing times. We provide food. For the third thing, we provide food, a variety of foods for food pantries in the local school. Number 4, we provide food for school backpack programs. And the 5th one is we provide a variety of foods to the local fire departments, police departments, and social service agencies to help feed those in need. To accommodate distributing food to these initiatives, we have developed what we call RDPs, Rural Distribution Points. We have 23 RDPs at this point, serving 251 partners in 7 states. We also have some one-time opportunities. By the end of the 3rd quarter of this year, we will have 2,300 partners and over 360,000 guests of honors to be served in rural America. So what are our needs? When working with schools, we have to meet USDA approved foods. Although Convoy of Hope works directly with non-perishable food sources, there is growing crisis in rural America for access to healthy food. When it comes to distribution models like our backpack programs, where we provide take-home rations for children, the need exists for healthy, microwavable items, food that young children can prepare on their own without placing them at risk. So day after day, Sophia comes straight off the school bus and over to the packing site to help, talking about her day as our partner eagerly listens. Every day, she takes a bag full of food home to her family. There are tens of thousands of Sophias across rural America living in generational poverty and perpetuating the cycle of abuse and need unless there is an intervention. We at Convoy of Hope get to play a part of the greater network of kindness and compassion determined to make a difference. Sophia's life has changed and Sophia's future has changed. Thank you.
Thank you, Convoy. So it looks like we have a few minutes for some questions. I get to ask some of those questions that we've got. One of the things, though, that I noticed that I wanted to ask real quick was Dr. Miller. Could you tell us a little bit about the kids on your last slide? I think you didn't mention that, and it's probably something that's pretty important to you.
Oh, thanks. No, thanks for mentioning that. I didn't want to get too into shameless plug, but I think, certainly preventative strategies for firearm injury are tough. And so what we've done here is we collaborated with a local nonprofit called Christopher 2X Game Changers. We built a gun violence prevention program that's targeted towards our 4 to 13-year-olds. So that slide, every one of those kids has either been shot at, or lost a mom, dad, brother, or sister here in Kentucky. And so the idea is that our medical students and our surgeons and community members spend a first Saturday of every month at the local hotel, Galt House, donated a space. And so we work in that, and we try to talk about wellness. We talk about nutrition. We talk about principles of healthy eating and general wellness, and then tie in some injury prevention in that. So thanks for asking. I appreciate that. That's nice of you to do.
Thank you. Also, let's see, we've got a couple questions. If you have questions, put them in the chat, and we've got a few minutes that we can field those. Also, before I get to those questions, though, we will also, if you have additional questions that we can't address on this, we will be distributing the slides and contact information so you can get in touch with the speakers and ask questions directly. I did get a question for Dr. Miller that came in. Whether or not you see any kind of connections or correlations with exposure to toxins like heavy metals in mining, manufacturing, or, there's been lots in the news in the past about, lead in pipes and different things like that. If in your research you've seen any connections there also.
Yeah, I'm wondering if that wasn't a plant from one of my good friends, Dr. Craig McLean and Matt Cave, who study environmental toxin exposure throughout Louisville, particularly obesogens, which are a class of environmental toxins that seem to contribute to a predisposition to developing obesity over time in populations. And so they've been trying to get me to study environmental toxin exposure throughout. I think if you look, I've not done the studies myself, but if you just Google environmental toxin exposure in Louisville, Kentucky, you can find maps that look very similar to what I showed you from a firearm injury, from a food insecurity perspective, from all those socioeconomic determinants of health, that they're heavily leaned towards the west side where a lot of these exposures are happening. So that was a very insightful question. So I've not done that research specifically, but it is out there. And that map looks very similar. We've got Rubbertown in Louisville. We've got multiple places where major manufacturing was happening across the Ohio River. And you'll see that much of that environmental exposure is concentrated in West Louisville, the same area that we talked about these other issues. So that's a very excellent question. So thank you.
Hey, Micah, I actually have a question if I could jump in for our Convoy of Hope team. So it's actually a two-parter. I think, we got into different initiatives, both global and local, and got a real spectrum of the activity at Convoy. Part one, I think it'd be interesting to understand how Convoy came to be and kind of what the overarching mission of Convoy is that's allowed the creation of all these programs. And then a second piece would be, given that you're speaking to the nutrition industry, there's a strong desire to engage and be, part of the solution. So from a Convoy perspective, what could our viewers potentially take away, or how could they potentially engage?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. Laura, I saw you popped on here. Did you want to take the founder story, or would you like me to?
Oh, you're on mute.
Hold on, you're on mute.
I can take the founder story, and then you can talk about.
Sounds great.
Okay, so the founders, three brothers, who their parents were killed in an automobile accident when they were young. And there was a family who reached out to them and showed them care and love and support. And it changed their hearts, their minds, how they look at the world, and said, when we get big, we're going to make a difference. That's the short of it. And Convoy of Hope is what came out of that. And that's it.
Thanks, Laurel. And I also like to hear Hal Donaldson is our founder, and we were started in 1994, so about 28 years that we've been working together as an organization. And he used to work as a journalist. And I think a story that really sticks out to me when I think about Convoy is he actually interviewed Mother Teresa. And so he was asking Mother Teresa, what can we be doing for the poor along those lines? And she just looked straight at him and said, well, what are you doing? And he always likes to say, you can't lie to Mother Teresa. You just can't. And so from there, it kind of set a trajectory of his life where he started handing out groceries in the back of his truck just when he could, and he had extra income to do so. And from there, our rural programs and domestic programming were launched. We also do large-scale community events and disaster services. So from that, we've got a full gamut of different initiatives that came from a very, very impactful heart and a great man. So thanks for also giving the opportunity to talk about nutrition and the companies that might be on here who could partner with us. If anybody is interested in learning more, we would love to sit down and show you in depth what we're doing around the world and how we might walk alongside each other to impact those most vulnerable. We have the ability to pick up and procure product from all across the country. And Amy, our nutritionist that was on here, we look at the diet diversity and the cultural complexes of everywhere that we work and try to find products that really match the nutritional needs. And we can do that in a lot of different ways. But as you saw, there were a lot of pictures of young kids, women, and girls, and those who are marginalized around the world. So we would like to serve as the convoy and the logistics side. So if anyone has any interest in partnering with us, we have a great story to tell, and we invite you into that story. Thanks.
Yeah. One more question. Also kind of along that same lines, does Convoy of Hope include dietary supplements and or functional foods as part of their food insecurity efforts? I also know that you guys do work with a few of our members and with accepting donations that are in the kind of functional food side of things, but you might kind of describe what types of products and stuff if it includes supplements or functional foods.
Yeah, it can. So I'm in our global program team, so I won't be able to name all of our incredible partners or the exact products, but if I talk about the impact that we can have with those or where those avenues and where we use them, maybe you guys can see if that matches along the lines the products that you guys have to offer. So through our large scale community events domestically and our rural initiatives programs, we're able to give product to very specific demographics. So we have the ability to work with local stakeholders. So if those therapeutic foods or dietary supplements or enriched foods, we make sure to handle those with care and so that they're getting to the end user that they will have the greatest impact on. We do work with, for example, MAP International, and so they're a large NGO that sends pharmaceuticals and medical supplies and things like that. So we are very aligned on where those specific products can go and where they can't. Amy alluded to a huge need for us is RUTFs, so ready to use therapeutic foods. We're moving into a very large season of food insecurity, and acute and chronic malnutrition is going to affect all over the world. And so we're going to be seeing a need for those specific products that we can implement at a very critical time of need for these children and save their lives. So we have the ability to support that with programming, education, local support staff, partnership with local clinics to really come alongside and make sure those products are used well and efficiently to serve the end user in the best way possible. So I hope that answers that. Not any specific product, but I hope that gives them some insight.
Yeah, it does. And on the RU2Fs, if I remember right, these are products that are being assembled by partners, correct? And so I think one of the things you can take also ingredients, not just finished products.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. We have a whole Grow to Give campaign that we've just launched. So that bulk raw food commodity or those bulk raw commodities in general, absolutely. We have a lot of partners that are able to put those into a product that we can use, or we can put them into recipes the way that they are. We have a lot of incredible partners we can't do alone, and we're not experts on everything. So we would definitely reach out and find ways to utilize those raw commodities in ways that we can implement them.
So examples there could be, protein powders, vitamin premixes, and things like that, of course, and then
yes,
a bunch of other things.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for spelling those out for everyone, because you know better than I do on those, and that's exactly right.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, we got like 1 more minute. There's one more question for Laurel. For those of us, so this person lives in Appalachia. So they're saying, for those of us that live in Appalachia, what is the greatest underlying root cause of nutritional inadequacy? What can we do today in that region?
Well, I think we
1 minute.
Okay, I think we go back again. It's the access to help, especially in the small, out of the way places. I was just recently in a little community, and they had a ribbon cutting for a laundromat. The closest laundromat was 45 minutes away. So you're a single mom, you have no washer and dryer. I mean, you have 45 minutes away. So the biggest struggle is access to help. So, and as Alyssa said, we have the convoy. We just need the stuff to put in the convoy to make it available.
Great. Okay, I think that we've actually gone over just a bit. That takes care of it. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. This is a very important. It's a very important work that we're doing, and thank you, Convoy, for doing this, and thanks for joining us. And I think that's it for today.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.